All right. Show me. It still is only doing the one from Shabbat. I see. I'm like looking at what I'm wearing. I'm like, is that? No, that's me from like a week ago. So, okay. By the way, this is what I decide to, like, when I have to get dressed on Friday nights, I have to come back and look and be like, did I wear this last week? Probably shouldn't wear it again. Yes. Yes. Oh, is that me again? Oh, that's funny. I didn't recognize my own voice. It's very annoying. No, I'm not. I mean, I'm looking at Facebook, but I'm not on the live stream. I still see Rabbi Shook from last night. Thank you, everyone. Slight technical difficulties. This is what happens when you're in your 40s. You can't use technology. I do want to say I couldn't use technology when I was a teenager either, so this is actually just me and not my age. Oh, look at you. There we are. Oh, it's magical. Wonderful. Okay, so I should just be able to see it pop up. Yes, it should be, hopefully. All right. This is going to be slightly distracting, but I'll do my best. All right.
Questions, come up to the microphone so we do hear it on the live stream so everybody who's watching can hear it too.
Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Hi to everyone watching from home. So as you probably just noticed by Murti and I struggling with this, what we're going to try and do, because we have so many people who are watching from home today, this is sort of the pros and the cons. So the bad news is that we have a lot of people who are sick. So I'm glad that you're able to stay home and just watch from the comfort and safety of your home. The good news is that we're able to live stream and have this be a little more interactive. The not as good news is that the subjects that we're talking about today are a little bit challenging to do in sort of just me speaking to you style, because both because of what the nature of sort of the Yoms are, and we'll talk about that a bit, but also because the topics that we're talking about that have to do with these holidays are probably the two things that we tend to be the worst at talking about, which is the Shoah and Israel. And so it's a little bit challenging for me to just stand up here and lecture about them. So I really do want and need to hear your questions and your questions at home. So if you are able to send me a message over Facebook Live or email me, I should be able to get them in almost real time, and we can have our conversation that way. So maybe we should start by sort of talking about why Manishtana, like why these holidays are different than every other holidays. So if you think about sort of what the Jewish holidays are, right? Many of our holidays, and the ones that we've spoken about so far, are ones that come straight from the Torah. So Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret, which in the Reform movement we sort of combine with Simchat Torah. We'll get to that another time, but and let's see what else, and Pesach, of course. Like, all of these are holidays, Shavuot, all of these are holidays that are in the Torah. Now, the way that we practice them is not all that much like how they're practiced in the Torah, because in the Torah they assumed that the Jewish people would have the ancient temple in Jerusalem, and they assumed that the way that we would communicate with God would be through animal sacrifice or some sort of sacrifice. When the ancient temple is destroyed, all of those things sort of go out the window, and we know that there's all these different teachings about how we started to figure out how to practice as Jews and all the different things we do without an ancient temple. So that's why if you're looking to figure out sort of how do I celebrate a holiday, I always tell people, please do not just go to the Torah and figure it out. Remember last time when we talked about Passover, like, do not kill goats and spread the blood all over your door. People will think you're weird. And there's all sorts of things that I don't want you to do that they say in the Torah. But we at least know some of the most basic holidays, and the way we live our Jewish lives, that's where they come from. Okay, so those are sort of the big ones. Tu B'Shvat, the birthday of the trees, a lot of those are in there. Then we get to the holidays that come a little bit later, some of which are still in the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, but maybe aren't in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses back there. So that's something like Hanukkah, right? So Hanukkah, actually it's not really in the Tanakh, a little bit of it is, but Hanukkah, which is a historical holiday, all right? And we learn about it in the book of Maccabees. Hanukkah, which is actually based off of the idea that they couldn't celebrate Sukkot, and so they had like their own Sukkot celebration later in winter. But so that's in our Jewish sacred scriptures. That's how we know about it from the Tanakh or from the Apocrypha. Those are like the extra books that didn't quite get in the Tanakh. Let's see, what other holidays are in sacred scriptures but not the Torah? Oh, you know what is a good one actually? We're not doing a whole session on this one, but it's still a fun one, is Tu B'Av. Tu B'Av is when we do our gala each year, so you can come to the gala if you want to. But what Tu B'Av is, it was this holiday where it's like people call it the Jewish Valentine's Day. It's not really Valentine's Day, but it's this idea that the girls would dress all in white and they would exchange clothes with each other, so that like the rich girls wouldn't have the nicest clothes and the poor girls wouldn't have, the oldest clothes. Everyone would share each other's clothes. They would all dress in white. They would go out into the fields and they would hope to fall in love and make a match. So something like that we actually know from the Talmud. There are a couple other sort of funky holidays that we know from the Talmud that come a lot later. There's one that's called it's like the water drawing festival. All these holidays, though, we either don't celebrate them much or they're very minor holidays, but still they're based in scripture. Any other Jewish holidays that you can think of that I haven't mentioned yet? Yeah. Oh, Lag BaOmer, beautiful. So Lag BaOmer, which is also a little bit of a later one, and that is, so right now we're talking the period from Pesach to Shavuot is this period where we do something called counting the Omer. My favorite website, by the way, if you like The Simpsons, there is a Counting the Homer website that is awesome, and Homer Simpson will help you learn about counting the Omer. But it's this idea of sort of doing a symbolic countdown from what it means to be liberated from slavery to the actual freedom that we get with receiving Torah, which is so beautiful. Lag BaOmer is a day sort of right in the middle of it, and Lag BaOmer is a super fun holiday where people do archery, just kind of random. I don't know. There is a textual reason for it, but it's a little bit of a stretch. But it also marks a day where there was a plague with Rabbi Akiva's students, and the plague lifted on Lag BaOmer. So there's a few different traditions that come with this one, but these are for the most part kind of small holidays that, unless you are living in Israel or unless you're sort of either a more observant Jew or you're like us, you're Jewish educators and you're looking for something fun to do, like that's usually, Lag BaOmer also, by the way, usually happens right around the end of religious school. So it's a great time to go out, have bonfires, and I don't know. We only did archery once here, as you can imagine. Did not turn out well. So we don't do a lot of archery with our religious school. Okay, so but all of these holidays are all Jewish holidays that in some way they have a textual basis. What we're talking about today, though, are the Yoms, as we call them. Yom means day in Hebrew. And so these are all these different Yoms that all have to do with the state of Israel in some way. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that, because one of them, Yom HaShoah, which is our Holocaust Remembrance Day, does actually have to do with the state of Israel, but all of these are relatively new holidays. The challenge with a new holiday, though, is figuring out, how do you create a holiday on your own? How do you make it Jewish? How do you make it special? And if there's no traditions in the Torah or in the Tanakh or in the Talmud to go back to, how do you tell people that this is an important thing? And I think maybe the best way to talk about this is to think about new American holidays, right? And I'm not just talking about the 4th of July, even though that's a good one too, right? Our American Independence Day, if you think about what we do on American Independence Day, there's nothing that happened, right, in 1776 that should imply that we should have barbecues on the 4th of July, right? There's no connection. That's just what we do. But if you think about sort of some of the newer holidays that we start to celebrate in America, like think about Juneteenth, right? That's only been an official holiday for 2 years, not very long, right? So things like Juneteenth, or right now where people are trying so hard to make Election Day a national holiday, which, God willing, we will get there very soon. But even so, we'll have to ask the question, well, what makes something a holiday? Is it simply that it is a Sabbath, right? It's a Shabbat where you don't have to go to work because you're doing something else? Or should there be some sort of rituals that you create to make it special and different than the rest of the year? And we also know, if we look at our own American calendar, that how many of you have ever been to a wedding on Memorial Day weekend? Seriously? Okay, I will just say that well, first of all, our anniversary is on Memorial Day weekend, but I don't think I have ever in my career not had a wedding on Memorial Day weekend. Usually I have 2, sometimes 3. Right? Now, does that have anything to do with remembering people who have died in service to our country? Absolutely not. But that is like every wedding planner and clergy person knows, that's what happens on Memorial Day weekend. Same with Labor Day, right? What do we do on Labor Day? Close the pool, get ready for school to start again. Has nothing to do with labor. So many of even our American holidays that we think should have some sort of great significance and rituals, maybe what we do does not have to do with that at all. So all of that then leads us to these new yoms that were created in the state of Israel. Okay, that was the orthodontist, not someone asking a question. All right, so the very first one that we're going to talk about, and this is also the one that happens first on the calendar, is Yom HaShoah. So when we talk about Yom HaShoah, probably the first thing that we have to do is talk about terms. So Shoah means disaster, let's say, in Hebrew. We do not call it Holocaust, and I'm going to get to why we don't call it Holocaust, but Yom HaShoah, the actual real name for it is Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura. Gvura is like heroism, strength and heroism, kind of. So that's the real official name for it. It is not the same as Holocaust Remembrance Day. So first we're going to talk about the words and then the date. So does anyone know the word Holocaust, where that comes from? Yeah? Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, so like caustic, right? We know that word. Caustic, it means burnt. Holo means whole, right? Entirely whole. So this, by the way, if you've ever read a King James translation of the Torah, you will be struck by the fact that you see the word Holocaust a lot, and it will freak you out if you're reading the King James. But the reason for that is that in Leviticus, when they talk about what in Hebrew we call the olah, the sacrifice that goes straight up to God because of the smoke, the word that they use for that is Holocaust. Now, this is super disturbing, but I want you to make a connection between the fact that olah, which is the Hebrew word for that sacrifice, is the same word, oleh, or aliyah, that we make for someone who moves to the land of Israel. This is intentional, as disturbing as it is, because there is always going to be a connection between those who died in the Holocaust, right? Those who were sacrificed and who were, it was horrible, right? But entirely burnt, and the idea of being enabled to go up to the land. Now, this is something really disturbing, and we don't talk about that linguistic connection a lot, but it is really there. So, but within sort of Jewish circles, we try not to use the word Holocaust as much. We still do, right? Because that's the name by which most people know it. But usually we use this word Shoah instead to be able to not have that terrible connotation. Now, there's also, though, a difference between International Holocaust Remembrance Day and Yom HaShoah. A few years ago, someone from our community reached out to me, and they were very bothered because we hadn't done anything for International Holocaust Remembrance Day. And on the one hand, he was right. You know, like this, it is still a day that we should mark. It is still important, but that is not what we as a Jewish community use to mark the Shoah. Because what International Holocaust Remembrance Day is, January 27th, the United Nations were the one that they decided on that day, and they did that because it is the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. Now that, of course, is an incredibly important day, but that's also the day when, right, the West stepped in to finally end the war. And those of us who know the history of the Shoah know that those actions could have been taken much, much sooner. So we don't necessarily honor this idea to say that when we mark, you know, the Shoah, that we should be marking like the day when America, you know, finally stepped in and saved us, that really we should be marking something else. So Yom HaShoah marks the beginning of the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. And gosh, there's like so many different things to say about that. So all right, so let's talk about why it's the Warsaw Ghetto. So when the state of Israel decided to declare what day Yom HaShoah would be, they had a little bit of a problem. Because, you know, the history of the Shoah, the history of the Holocaust, it's not just that it is like the most horrific events in modern history, but it's also, it has this legacy that made a lot of modern people, modern Jews too, feel very uncomfortable. And even in the state of Israel, there was this sense that the Jews had been like lambs led to the slaughter, right? That there was this idea that so many of the Jews in Europe, that they could have fought back and they didn't. And so when Israel created the idea of Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, right, the day of remembering the Shoah and the heroism there, they wanted to pick a date where they could say, no, this is when the Jews fought back. This is when they did everything they could to fight against what was happening. When we talk about the Shoah, no matter what, it's a little bit hard for us to sort of know. There was my computer. Know where to begin. Sorry, let me put this back on again. In maybe a week or two, I lost my Facebook page. Okay. In maybe a week or two, the Lilith Book Club, we're meeting again, and we're going to be reading this book called People Love Dead Jews. Okay? Go out and read this book. It is so difficult and so amazing. There's also a podcast, by the way. So the podcast is not exactly like the book, but it's really good. People Love Dead Jews is written by a woman named Dara Horn, who is totally like my author crush. I totally want to be her, or at least like hang out with her. And Dara Horn is, she's written a bunch of Jewish novels, but she talks about the idea that she is often approached to talk about the Shoah, to talk about the Holocaust. And she kept wondering, why is it that people so badly, they want to talk about dead Jews, but they don't want to talk about what it was really like to be Jewish? And she traces this back to an encounter that she had when she was a teenager, and the Holocaust Museum in DC opened. Has anyone been to that museum before? Okay. So the Holocaust Museum in DC, actually, how many of you have ever been to a Holocaust museum? So what have you been to? Beautiful, beautiful. What else? Anyone else? Yeah. Wow. Awesome. Yeah. So all of these museums are very different, and each of them really presents the Shoah in a different kind of way. When the museum in DC opened, and it opened in like the mid-90s, I think, and it was really presented as being like this was going to be the coolest Holocaust museum that ever there was. And I will say, like, it is actually a remarkable museum. It is definitely worth going to. Each of these museums has a different way of sort of presenting it. So like if you go to Yad Vashem in Israel, which they've done a renovation recently, and it's incredible. I mean, it's like so amazing. But Yad Vashem in Israel, they intentionally lay out the rooms in such a way that when you go in, you feel very claustrophobic, right? Like a lot of it is about not just what you're looking at, but how you feel. So DC does the same thing. When you go in, they push you into an elevator and they try to get as many people in the elevator as possible. I don't know what they do after COVID, but at least like pre-COVID, and it was intentional, right, to make you feel super uncomfortable. But what the DC Museum is most famous for is the children's exhibit. And they have this children's exhibit where you are following the life of a boy named Daniel, who was a Jewish kid who died in the Holocaust. So Dara Horn, when she is a teenager, she is already getting into writing, and she is called upon to review this exhibit and to sort of share her feelings about it in like some teen magazine. So she talks about, this is not going to ruin the book, you should still read the book, but she talks about this idea that she goes and she sees this exhibit about Daniel, and it's so wonderful. And you go in, the first room is like supposed to be Daniel's house, and you see, and there's like a soccer ball, and there's trophies, and he's got his own room, and it's so wonderful, and you really get a sense like Daniel, he's just like us. And then they show when they're moved into the ghetto, and now he's living in this room, and it's very cramped and all this stuff. And then the last part of the exhibit is when his family is deported, and you don't see what happens after that. So Dara Horn tells this story about how she gives this museum marvelous reviews and how wonderful it is, because it just gives people this real experience of what it would have been like to be a Jew in the Holocaust. And she talks about sharing this, and she's sitting at a Passover table, and there's a Holocaust survivor there. And this woman, the Holocaust survivor, who she didn't know at all, starts chewing her out. And she's like, "Oh, you think that exhibit is so good?" And Dara's like, "Yeah, this is amazing. It makes you feel like you're just one of them, that Daniel was just a kid just like us." And the woman's like, "But he wasn't. The people who died in the Holocaust were Jews. And if you stop thinking of them as Jews, if there's nothing in that room that makes you think about everything that was lost, and the religion and the culture, and why does this kid have to look like an American? Why can't he truly look like the vast majority of the Jewish community that was murdered? Then you've lost it entirely." So Dara Horn talks about how her whole life she's been struck by this conversation, and that always stuck with her. And now as an adult in her 40s, she realizes this is what we lose when we talk about the Shoah, is that we work so hard to make sure that it's a universal experience and everyone understands how terrible it was and how the Jews, they're just like us. And her point is to say that they're not. This should not be a holy day that is owned by everyone. We need to find some way to say that the Shoah was distinct, and obviously we know that many people were murdered who weren't just Jews, but that for the most part, it was the Jewish community of Europe that was killed in this way. Okay, so all of this, I know that was endless, but all of this brings us back to Yom HaShoah, which is to say that when we talk about Yom HaShoah, even versus Holocaust Remembrance Day, there is this question of, should this be a holiday where we say, the dead Jews, they're just like us, right? Or do we really have to take this time to be able to go back and look over all that was lost? And so this has been this issue with Yom HaShoah since its inception, trying to figure out what is it that we are trying to experience on this day? What is it that we are trying to connect others to? And you'll see with Holocaust Remembrance Day, the day in January that was put out by the United Nations, you'll see on your Facebook feeds and in any programs you go to, and this is within St. Louis too, that you are also going to hear people talking about the other Holocausts that have happened in history and saying, why are we marking the Shoah and not talking about Darfur and not talking about all of these other terrible events? And it's this big question for us as a Jewish community, like, should we be conflating those two things, or should everything have its own separate time? Even if you look about what's happening right now in Ukraine and how people have been really upset, trying to think, because when the president said, this is just like what happened at Baba Yar, right? Like that people are saying, can you even make connections to the Holocaust, or does it need to be this separate thing? All right, any comments or questions so far? It's a little bit of a complicated topic because, especially for those of us who lost family members, right? Like it feels incredibly personal, but we also need to make sure that we are not glorifying the Shoah either, right? That we aren't so focused on remembering who we are because of this tragedy that we lose the future. In our Intro to Judaism class that Rochelle is taking with me, we're having this conversation because we're talking about, if you look at the history of the Jewish people and you have this lachrymose conception of Judaism where all you're doing is saying something terrible happened to us, we survived, let's eat, right, over and over and over again, that maybe you're missing on like what really happened with the good stuff in between, that it shouldn't just be a history of terrible, tragic things that happened to the Jewish people.
It was kind of interesting that right after the war, so many survivors didn't want to talk about that, understand at all.
Yeah.
And now we got to the point where we're trying to figure out how to celebrate it, quote unquote.
Yeah.
And to me, I had a really good conversation with my the doctor on Friday. That's all. He was talking about how he's Persian Jew and his family's been in Iran for 2,000 years.
Wow.
So like no matter what the world tries to do to us, we don't.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we celebrate. Really not necessarily the event itself, but just once again, we try.
Right. Right. I mean, I think there is this question. So for those watching at home, so Michael's just talking about this idea that maybe what we should focus on is the survival instinct, right? The ability of the Jewish people to survive, that's more meaningful and more worthy of our time focusing on than what happened in the Shoah. And I know, like, even within my own family, my grandparents came here in '39 from Germany, and my grandpa died before I was born. But here's the interesting thing. So my grandmother, my Oma, never talked about it. Not only did she not talk about it, but the few times where she would, her stories changed over the years. So we actually are not entirely sure, what happened to them in the '30s. Sometimes there were, stories where her brother had been in a camp. Sometimes he hadn't. She also later in life insisted that she had never been back to Germany, but I know she did because I've seen the pictures, right? So she sort of recreated her own personal history for what was comfortable for her. My grandfather, who I never met, this is crazy. So we found, my son is at the middle school in Ladue, and they had a project about the Holocaust. And so we were like, oh, I wonder if we have anything. So we found this like treasure trove of letters that my grandfather had written, and we just never looked at. And for him, he loved being an American so much. And he never talked about his experience in Germany, but the passion with which he loved this country was very clearly because of sort of what he experienced. And there's like all sorts of like crazy stuff. Sorry, this is not connected, but I just have to share the story because it's so beautiful. We found this letter of his that he wrote, and he talks about, they came to Cincinnati, that's where they came after Frankfurt, and he talks about that he and my grandmother, they end up in Frankfurt, and they're there, and it's Hanukkah. And they'd only been in Cincy for like 2 weeks, and they didn't really have anything. They came here with no money, and he is in some sort of a store. And when he was in Germany, he was in the theater. That wasn't his job, but it was like his side gig. And he's in this store in Cincinnati, and someone says, are you Max Federline? I saw you in a show, in Frankfurt. And my Opa is apparently like, that's who I am. And this guy says, welcome to America. We're having a Hanukkah party at the JCC. It's starting right now. Do you and your wife want to come? And so he brings my Oma and Opa to this Hanukkah party. And my Opa, because he was very theatrical and liked to speak, they invite him up to the podium, and he gives this whole speech about like what being an American means to him. And it's so amazing. And he like transcribed it afterwards, but it was really just one of those stories that I think it's very hard for us to try and imagine what it would have been like, not just what happened in Europe, but what it was like for those immigrants who came to this country and had nothing, and just the idea that this Jewish community is sort of there for you wherever you go. Anyway, I digress, but we just found this and it's so cool. So, all right, so going back to Yom HaShoah then. So you have this date, and they're doing it they started in the state of Israel. They declare, by the way, in 1951. So if you think about it, Israel's already been officially a state for a few years, but there's already, quite a lot of survivors who are in the land of Israel. And so they decide that they're going to declare this day so that they can make sure that the people who are survivors, that they are given some sort of kavod, some sort of honor. Because also, if you think about those pictures that you've seen of early Zionists, right? And they're of these really brawny looking Jews, and they're getting their hands in the soil in the kibbutz. And it's this beautiful image of what they wanted the new Israelis to look like. But many of them were survivors, and they didn't look like that. And they didn't necessarily want to work the soil. Many of them were older when they came to that country, and they never lost their accents, and they were never, really able to learn Hebrew. And so having this day was a day of validating who these survivors were, not just because it was because of them, those who were not, Holocaust, right? Those who were not sacrificed up, but that they were really the ones who had been able to retain their dignity under the most deplorable of conditions, to say that they deserve this sort of honor. So the way that that this day is honored in Israel is there is a siren, and it stops all traffic, and pedestrians stop where they're going. It goes for a full 2 minutes. It blows at sundown when the holiday begins, and then again at 11 the next morning. And anything that they have on radio and TV in Israel is supposed to be in some ways dedicated to the Holocaust. There's also no public entertainment that happens on Yom HaShoah. So it is definitely a serious sort of day. There are some folks who choose to light a yahrzeit candle, one of those little yellow candles that we have that you do when someone dies, that people will light a yahrzeit candle on those days. And then there has been some cool liturgy that has been written, like prayers. So Elie Wiesel and Rabbi Albert Friedlander, they created something that was, if you think about there's 5 scrolls on some of the different holidays throughout the year. So they created something that they call a 6th scroll that was supposed to be a scroll for the Shoah, and is supposed to include all of these different narratives about it. I've never actually heard of anyone using this 6th scroll, but I know that it's out there. Oh, sorry, I lost me for a second. Here in St. Louis, we haven't done it since COVID, but every year there is a service where each of the synagogues takes turns hosting it, and those of us who have a memorial scroll, that's the one we have out there, we walk with these scrolls, and there is usually an opportunity to hear the stories of survivors. So the scroll, by the way, I'm pointing to it as if you can see it, but the scroll that we have and that many synagogues have, it's called a Westminster scroll. We call it the Holocaust scroll, but its official name is a Westminster scroll. And what these scrolls are is that one of the things that the Nazis decided to do is they believed, when they had this idea that they were going to kill all of the Jews, they still had this idea that they should maintain some sort of a museum that was going to be sort of remembering this race of people who had been murdered. And so what they did is they would take all of these different Jewish artifacts, and the idea was that they were going to create this museum with all of this stuff. So after the war ended, many of the Torah scrolls and the other artifacts were gathered together and are now on loan at different synagogues throughout the world. So we have one that is out there, and we have a little ark for it. What's interesting about it is that, like many of these scrolls, because it wasn't used for so long, if you think about Torah and that they're made out of parchment, and it's very important to roll your Torahs with some frequency, because otherwise they get brittle and things don't quite work. And so what has happened with our scroll out there is that because it wasn't used for so many years, when you turn it, the letters literally fly off the page, which I actually think is like so beautiful and so remarkable, the idea of the, the letters rising from the page. But because of that, we really don't read from ours very often because we don't want to destroy this thing that, that was able to survive for so long. One other thing I wanted to tell you about Yom HaShoah. And it'll come back to me, but the other thing that I was just going to add, going back to the idea of focusing on the Shoah, is that many universities now have Holocaust studies departments, but they don't have Yiddish departments, and they don't necessarily have Jewish studies departments. So there's also this idea, it goes back to what is it that people want to learn and they want to remember, and is it that we should be focusing on the Holocaust, the Shoah itself, or should we be going back to really thinking about that which was lost and the culture and the people who were lost to the Shoah? There are a few Yiddish departments out there. University of Michigan had one, and there's a very cool YIVO. It's like it's in New York, and it's a Yiddish book center, and we've had a few kids do internships there actually from here. But a lot of that culture has truly been totally lost. All right, last thing I was going to say about Yom HaShoah before I forget is if anyone reads the New Yorker, there was a really cool article a week or two ago, but about Baba Yar and the idea that they were creating this museum where Baba Yar was, and it stopped because of everything happening in Ukraine. But it is like this really cool article about sort of the way that we remember the Shoah and how important it is to have these markers or to have these ways to honor it or not. Okay, any other Shoah stuff that people have questions about or want to talk about? Again, I highly recommend this book. It's super upsetting and so good. It's like I've had it for a year and I just couldn't force myself to read it, and now I can't stop because it's so brilliant. Yeah, or People Love Dead Jews. Yeah, and it's a book of essays, but it's really it's just a really interesting way to look at what it is that we should focus on when we look at Jewish history. But she's the coolest. Okay, so after we talk about Yom HaShoah, the next holiday that we get to is Yom HaZikaron. So Yom HaZikaron is Israeli Memorial Day. And when I said that in America Memorial Day tends to be weddings, right? I mean, and even here, by the way, like when we have the Shabbat of Memorial Day weekend, we always read the names of those who died in service. But I think for many of us, if you don't have a direct connection to someone who served in the military or, God forbid, who lost their lives, then Memorial Day doesn't often mean that much to us. And I think we see this more and more. Thank God that there is no draft right now. Like it's just not something that most of our generations have dealt with. But I think it does sort of make the idea of Memorial Day a little bit farther away. It's different in Israel because of how many Israelis serve in the army. Now, I want to share that at least when I was a kid, I was taught that every Israeli needs to serve in the army. That is not actually true anymore. So there you go. Okay, so now were you were able to draft to dodge it because you have dual citizenship? Yeah. Wow. Yes, yeah, I think that's correct. So, but what's interesting though is that there are many more draft dodgers than there used to be. And that makes sense, right? Because when the state of Israel was founded, this idea of being able to fight for the land was so important, right? And it connects, again, to the Shoah, because it connects to this idea that if you perceive that all of these people had been sort of led to the slaughter, well, now you have this idea of what it means to be able to actually fight for the land. And so you have this image of what it would mean to be a soldier. We talked about this in the intro class too, that if you know the story of Masada, right? So the story of Masada, which happens, 2,000 years ago, but is this idea of sort of the last holdout against the Romans, and you have all these Jewish people, and they're living on top of Mountain Masada, and this is like a very long story abbreviated into 2 sentences, but they end up saying that rather than become slaves to the Romans, that they would rather take their own lives, and so they all take their own lives on the top of Mount Masada. When the state of Israel was founded, it used to be that Israeli soldiers would go up to Mount Masada, and what they would say when they were being, sworn into the army is they would say, "Masada shall not fall again." So that was the story that I was raised with, and that was true in Israel for a long time. It's not true anymore, and there's a few different reasons. First is, as Israel has developed as a country, there is this new idea to say, like, is this something that we want to give our lives for, right? Like, is the dream of being an Israeli someone who is going to fight to the death to say that Israel should exist? Or are Israelis like so many Americans, and we want to live and we want to be happy, but if you ask me, would I ever serve and fight for my country? Probably not, first of all, because I would be terrible at it, but also, like, it's not who I am. And I think you have many more Israelis who feel that way. There are also a lot of Israelis who, because of something about their lives, do not have to fight. So you can be like mine, you can have dual citizenship and have a way out. But also, if you are ultra-Orthodox, most of the Orthodox do not actually serve in the army. There are some, some who do, but very few of them do. Interestingly, who will fight in the army are the Druze, who are so cool. Like, we hung out with the Druze family when we were there this last time, and it was the best experience. But they're non-Jews, but they live, yeah. 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 Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think part of this is that living in the state of Israel today is just a different, it's a different feeling than it used to be, because since so many of the Jews, at least, are several generations now from the Holocaust, they don't necessarily think of it as, this is the only safe place where I can be a Jew anymore. That's just not necessarily how many modern Israelis were raised. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't serve in the military. One of the things about serving in the military is that it is the best way to make any sort of connection within the country. So when we were there a few weeks ago, I would say, like, every single day we were going around with a guide. I would say every single day our guide would randomly run into someone as we were touring Israel who he would know from when he was serving in the army, when he was in his 20s, and he was in his 40s now. And he said, that the best thing about serving in the army, and he said, by the way, that he hated it. He was in a tank. He said it was terrible. I counted down every day. It was just an awful experience. But now he said, if you want to get a job, if you want to find a plumber, if you are looking for, a play group for your kids, you're probably going to connect back with the people that you served with. And if you didn't do that, people look at you differently. And I was trying to think if there is an American equivalent for that. I'm not sure. The only one I could come up with is thinking about that some people feel that way about their college. Like, if you feel a particularly strong connection to their college. Yeah, Michael.
Well, so I'm 85.
Okay, perfect.
There's an 85 business networking Facebook group.
Beautiful.
And 14,000 guys. I needed, for a friend of mine, an attorney in LA, Saturday night, I posted at 10 o'clock at night.
Yeah.
That I needed this specific type of attorney in LA. Within 10 minutes, I had 15 references.
Exactly. I mean, there is something about that ability to network. And so I went to Michigan, and by the way, when I went there, like, I went to one football game, right? I did not care at all about Michigan. I still don't. However, the rabbi who preceded me here went to Michigan. The president who hired me went to Michigan, and, like, it meant something, right? It didn't really mean anything to me, but to them, they were like, oh, Michigan, and I was like, go blue, right, blue, whatever color we are. But so it is like that in Israel as well, that there is this thing, and if people know, like, were you a paratrooper? Like, they're the coolest, right? If you're a paratrooper, you can get whatever you want, right? And so there is this sense that if you don't serve, people looked at you as a little bit suspect. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Right. Right. And there is still a sense, I mean, it's not even like machismo, but it is this sense of like that it's just what you do. And for women too, right? Women are also expected to serve. They serve a little bit less time, but there is this assumption that that if you didn't, like what exactly is wrong with you if you chose not to serve? So because of that, when we think then about Yom HaZikaron, there is always going to be this idea that no matter what, you're going to know someone who was a soldier and who died for the state of Israel. And so because of that, it's something that people are very close to. There is a poem that is read at most Yom HaZikaron sort of ceremonies. It's kind of like their version of the Gettysburg Address, like that kind of thing that people, maybe you don't know the whole thing by heart, but you sort of know it. So the poem is called The Silver Platter, and it goes like this. And the land will grow still, crimson skies dimming, misting, slowly paling again over smoking frontiers, as the nation stands up, torn at heart but existing, to receive its first wonder in 2,000 years. As the moment draws near, it will rise, darkness facing, stand straight in the moonlight in terror and joy. When across from it, step out, towards it slowly pacing, in plain sight of all, a young girl and a boy dressed in battle gear, dirty, shoes heavy with grime, on the path they will climb up, while their lips remain sealed, to change garb, to wipe brow. They have not yet found time, still bone-weary from days and from nights in the field, full of endless fatigue and all drained of emotion, yet the dew of their youth is still seen on their head, thus like statues they stand, stiff and still with no motion, and no sign that will show if they live or are dead. Then a nation in tears and amazed at this matter will ask, "Who are you?" And the two will then say with soft voice, "We are the silver platter on which the Jews' state was presented today." Then they fall back in darkness as the day's nation looks, and the rest can be found in the history books. Right? So kind of intense, but that's the national poem. And almost every like high school in Israel has a memorial corner, right, where they're remembering those who graduated, who were killed. It's not a religious holiday, right? But that doesn't mean that there aren't memorial opportunities for it. So Yom HaZikaron, the next day after it is Yom HaAtzmaut, Israeli Independence Day. So obviously these two are intentionally put together, and that's the Hebrew date of the formal establishment of the State of Israel. It was May 14th, 1948, but we go by the Hebrew calendar. And so the official switch from Yom HaZikaron to Yom HaAtzmaut, it takes place a few minutes after sundown. There is a ceremony usually on Mount Herzl in Jerusalem where the flag is raised from half staff. President of Israel gives a speech, and there's soldiers there, and then there's usually a torch lighting ceremony. Besides that, for Yom HaAtzmaut as Israeli Independence Day, it's still sort of a holiday in the making, even though we've been celebrating it since 1948. But again, if you think about the 4th of July, right? Like the 4th of July, there's not a standard, fireworks. Is there a reason we do that besides the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air? I think that's probably it, right? But most of the stuff what we do on the 4th of July is really just we sort of create our own things about how we're going to celebrate American Independence Day. So it's a national holiday, but sort of similarly to here, it's more of sort of just a day off and a celebration. There are some people who are trying to make it into a more religious holiday. So there's something on many sacred days on the Jewish calendar, we add something called Hallel into our services. It's a group of psalms that you read. So for some people, they will add Hallel into the service on Yom HaAtzmaut. if you're not someone who has a regular synagogue prayer life, then you're probably not going to notice that, like, oh, we're adding in, a few 5 extra minutes of Psalms here, but that is one of the discussions. I will also say, though, that not everyone celebrates Yom HaAtzmaut, Israeli Independence Day, even within Israel. And now we're going to start to talk about some confusing Israel stuff, so we'll do what we can, but there are people who live within the state of Israel who do not believe that there should be a state of Israel. And I'm not actually talking about even the non-Jews at this point. I'm talking about Jewish people. So there are Jewish people who live in Israel who don't believe that Israel should be a state. It's mainly within the ultra-Orthodox community. And for them, it is because they believe that the time when Israel will be rebuilt as a state is when Moshiach comes, when the Messiah comes. And because we believe the Messiah hasn't come yet, they don't believe that we should be like pushing the Messiah's hand and creating a state of Israel. So it's this sort of weird thing where you have Jews who are living within the comfort of being in a Jewish state who don't actually believe it should exist, but that is just sort of one of the weird things about Israel that make it Israel. But then, of course, we also have the problem of that, that as we know, and this is where I am up for questions, but this is one of our challenging topics, is talking about sort of what it means to believe that the state of Israel should exist, and what that means for the Palestinians and what that means for non-Jews who are living in the land. So part of this connects a little bit to our last holiday, which we don't have that much to say about, but I'll just put it out there and then we can talk about Israel a little bit, which is Yom Yerushalayim, that's Jerusalem Day. And that one commemorates the reunification of Jerusalem in 1967. So this is when we talk about sort of the hot topics, right? The hot topics in Israel today. This is one of the biggest ones, is what do we think about Jerusalem? What do we think about the borders that were laid in place after 1967? So before I just keep talking, I guess I should ask, when I asked for questions before, the best question that I got was, Rabbi, what question do you wish that people were asking? So I don't really have a question that I wish that people are asking, but I want to acknowledge just before we dive into Israel that this is a very confusing topic for most American Jews. It's also very confusing even for Israelis, right? Because most of them do not have just a clear opinion about this is what Israel should look like. This is what should be done with the Palestinians. This is what should be done with the settlers. Like, it's not. It is such a complicated situation that I can do my best to sort of respond to specific questions, but it is complex. So I can keep talking about things like the peace process and who the Palestinian Authority are and all that stuff, but if you have a question first, tell me and I can try to respond to that. Okay, all right, so let me start with what the green line is, because I feel like that is important. And I did try to print out a map. Did that actually work? Yeah, but the green line didn't print out green. So first, well, that's not really working. All right, for folks watching at home, give me just a moment. So for folks who are watching at home who are interested in learning more about Israel, and I will do my best to explain some things here, but one of the most challenging things is where are you going to get your information from? And I've talked about this so much over the past few years, where people should get their info from, but when we're talking about Israel, my suggestion, it's different if you want to hear about news, right? So if you want to hear about news in Israel, I would suggest looking at 2 newspapers, looking at Jerusalem Post and looking at Haaretz. That will give you a little bit of a diverse perspective for Israeli news. If you're looking at things like how, as an American, should I understand Israel, then I would look at the websites of either J Street or AIPAC. So these are political organizations that are intended for American Jews to better understand Israel. J Street is going to have more of a leftist perspective. AIPAC is going to have more of a right perspective, but neither of them are extreme, right? Like J Street and AIPAC people do get along. They all go to the same dinners, right? Like they're not to such extremes that you can't find truth from both of them. So if you have questions, those are the two websites I would go to. Do not use Google for this. Like, it is really, like, if you go to Google, you're going to find some crazy stuff, and it's very hard to know if they're reliable sources. So J Street and AIPAC will direct you to the most reliable sources you can find for this. So, the map that I was just showing everyone of the Green Line, which I recognize you won't be able to see if I'm showing it to the camera, but what's important to recognize is that the Green Line is, it's not like someone just took Israel and divided it in two, right? Like, you can't just say, this is where the Jewish people live and this is where the Palestinians live. It is two big chunks right in sort of the heart of Israel. So when people say, oh, it should be, is there a two-state solution? That's the biggest issue with it, is where would those two states be? So it's not even like if you think about the Civil War in America, where it was the North versus the South, which obviously even that was not, very clean. It wasn't really cut in half. But in Israel in particular, it is not easy to say if there were going to be a separate Palestinian state, this is where it will be. So when we talk about the Green Line, though, this is, it separates the West Bank, and the West Bank, by the way, is not on the west of the country, which is very confusing for people. It's the West Bank of Jordan. So it's actually on the east of the country, but we call it the West Bank. Super confusing. So these territories are, the US and the international community will say that these are the occupied territories. You will not hear that from all Israelis. And by the way, if you ever want to know sort of what political side an Israeli is on, that's the first question to ask them, is what do they call that land? If they call it occupied, that's different than saying the shtachim, which is more just like the territories. There's lots of different words. If they call it Samaria, Judah and Samaria, you know that they're more to the right. Like, just the words of how we refer to these territories tells you a lot about what people believe about it. But the West Bank of the Jordan, it has 2 million Palestinians living there and about 350,000 Jews. So this is an area that is there's a lot of Palestinians who are living there, but the Israeli government is overseeing it. Sorry, I'm trying to be careful with my language as well. I'm not doing a great job of it. So the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, has recognized Israel's right to exist within the Green Line, but they're always sort of trying to figure out what are the concessions. The issue with what's happening over the Green Line in those territories is that the Jewish residents of those areas, they are citizens and they have the right to vote and they can receive public funding and benefits. But the Palestinians who are living there, they're subject to Israeli military law, but they don't have the right to vote. And they can be tried and sentenced by the Israeli military. So there are so many different conflicts there, and what you will hear from maybe the folks at AIPAC, and it's funny, I printed out both J Street and AIPAC things, and even though they're not supposed to be that far apart, they are so far apart in the way they present things. But what you will hear for people who are not in favor of giving that land to Israel proper, what they will remind you of is that when the State of Israel was founded in 1948, it was actually intended to be a state not just for Jews, but also for the Muslims and the Christians living in the land and for the Arabs living in the land. And what happened was Israel declares independence in 1948, and the next day a war begins, right? So if you think about the opposite that happened in America, we fight a war and then become a country, the reverse happens in Israel. And so they will say, well, this is it. The Palestinians have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. That used to be what we would talk about the Palestinians, especially under Yasser Arafat, a lot. And so everyone wants for there to be peace. Everyone believes that there should be bilateral talks. But this idea of a two-state solution has been presented sort of again and again, and has often been rejected. One of the other big issues, let's maybe talk about what the biggest issues are with this happening. So the biggest issues with having with how we would figure out to have a two-state solution. So first is borders, right? Where would the borders of an independent Palestine and an independent Israel be? And as I said, it's not very clear because the Green Line doesn't just run down the center of the country. So figuring out what that would look like is pretty critical. The next is Jerusalem. So when we talk about Yom Yerushalayim, Jerusalem Day, which is the day that we celebrate as unification of Jerusalem again, well, both Palestinians and Jews recognize Israel as their capital, and that doesn't really work very well if you have two different people who are recognizing this as the capital. And you've seen even this week, right, like all of these conflicts that are happening over Jerusalem. And if you read the Post-Dispatch, they have their own particular viewpoint of it, and so is the New York Times. So sort of depending on your perspective as well, it's hard to read between the lines and see what's really happening there. Probably both sides are in the right and in the wrong. That is usually what the case is. But most Israelis have said that they, as much as they want a two-state solution, that they do not believe that Israel should give up Jerusalem at all, that they should not return any piece of Jerusalem to Palestine. So Jerusalem is a super, super hot topic. There also is an issue. So for the most part, the Palestinians, they're centered in East Jerusalem. In the past few years, there have been a lot of conflicts about certain neighborhoods within East Jerusalem and homes being razed by the Israeli side. What's fascinating if you go there is the area that they're talking about is super duper small, but it's people's, their emotions run high when we're talking about this. The only parallel that I can give you is if you think about, this was maybe a year ago, along Olive, right at the intersection of Olive and 170, where you had that neighborhood that was mainly like a Chinese and a Black neighborhood, and they tore down all those establishments because they want to build a Walmart. Costco, there you go, Costco. Well, it's a Costco. If it was a Walmart, it's a different story. But and there was a lot of upset about it because they were like, here is this neighborhood, and you have all these immigrants who are living there who've built these beautiful lives, and you're going to tear it down for a Costco of all places. But by the way, like that issue went away. I don't know if you've noticed. Hasn't been in the paper for a long time. So. Interesting. Yeah. I mean, there were a lot of, but even that, people are like, oh, the food was so good there, right? And for the most part, it wasn't that big of an issue. In Israel, it's a huge issue, right? So even if you have these really small neighborhoods, it became like an international event. So Jerusalem is their big issue. The other two big ones, one is security, which is what you're going to hear most Israelis talking about. Even when you talked about the years ago after the Second Intifada in 2001, when they built the wall right in Israel to try and prevent more terrorist attacks, that most Israelis will say, like, this is about security. And Americans, you have no idea what it feels like to feel like you cannot go to the grocery store or out to a restaurant without truly feeling like there is a good chance that you will, you'll be putting your lives at risk. So security is always going to be a huge issue. And then the last is talking about refugees and sort of this idea of the Palestinians who were forcibly removed from their homes, do they have the right to come back? So all of these are such huge issues, and I think that for American Jews, there's always this question of like, what is it that we can and should be doing? Because it's not so simple, going back to our Yoms, right? It's not so simple as saying, it's Yom HaAtzmaut, let's go eat falafel and celebrate Israel. Like, we know that Israel is a very, very challenging place. And I think, the only perspective that I can offer on it is when I talk to people who are not American about what it's like to live in America and to deal with race here and to deal with, everything that's happening in American society. And you have to say to them, well, it's not that simple, right? Like, it's never as simple as it seems if you're reading the story of someone else's life. And I think with Israel, it's never that simple either. And it's more about the idea that if you want to have a perspective on Israel, that it's important to actually to do your homework and really talk to Israelis and understand where they're coming from and try to put yourself in their shoes. And when I say they, I mean both, Jewish Israelis and Palestinians as well, because it is so complicated and they are all, right and wrong. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Right. 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 Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Oh, I think it absolutely does. And I think, it's, I often feel the same way also, like when people talk about Israel and get very defensive, and when they use the term apartheid state, and it just bothers me so much because I feel like they are just spouting whatever they read on their Facebook feed or whatever particular bias source they used without really understanding it. And I think it's, as Jews or as members of the Jewish community, it's important for us to understand all the nuances and not necessarily be defensive about it, but in the same way that, that here we are in America, right? And we are living on, we were not the first people living in this land, right? But how often do we truly acknowledge that? And I just think there is this real sense of superiority that is hard to not look at some sort of anti-Semitic roots. And I think people will keep going back again and again to the UN and saying, like, why is it that Israel is constantly called out, but no one is talking about what's happening in China like, oh my gosh, exactly. Like there's but even so, the other perspective that we have to say is, okay, but what did we say that it meant to be a Jew? It said that we were going to be a light unto the nations. And it said that we were going to be the people who keep these values even when no one else does, right? Like the beautiful teaching says, but makom she'ein anashim hishtadel li'el ish, right? Like in a place where where no one's acting like a person, you got to be the human, right? Like you have to be the mensch. And that's who we are as a Jewish people. And so we do and we should hold Israel to a higher standard. I'd like to think that we can, but that's very easy for me to say from the safety of my home. It's a different experience. Yeah.
I also think the West, it's a lot of lip service.
For sure.
We're discussing one area in the region that has no mineral value.
Yeah.
No oil.
Yeah.
And the only benefit to the West in keeping Israel strong is to have democratic power within the region.
Yeah.
Operate.
Yeah.
There were oil there would have solved the problem. I remember when I was married, when she spoke over Rwanda, and she was very upset. Said, "Why didn't you go in and fix the problem? Why didn't you go in and help these people? There's no oil,
Yeah.
And that's the currency of the world.
Yeah.
And that's I think the issue in Israel is that it's okay for the whole problem to keep going on for centuries.
Right.
Go on for another 250 years. We're not going to do anything.
Right.
Because there's no reason.
Right. Yeah, and I think also, just when we're talking about sort of why America is involved, I think for a lot of American Jews, the past, 6 years or so have been very confusing for Americans because, and again, like we are a purple congregation. We've got Republicans and Democrats alike, right? But the Israelis, for the most part, loved Donald Trump, because he was very much on the side of Israel and defending Israel. And a lot of American Jews who were not fans of Donald Trump were really a little bit freaked out by that idea, because here, this is this president who we feel like everything about him is so antithetical to who we are as human beings, right? But did he love Israel? And so it became really challenging also for a lot of American Jews who had been supportive of Israel for so long, and then when they saw Bibi Netanyahu and Donald Trump being like bosom buddies, it was really that I think hurt the Israeli cause in America, because there was this sense of like, ooh, maybe we don't like Israel after all. Now that Bibi is not in power anymore, it's a little bit different, even though the new leadership in Israel are still sort of finding their footing. Israeli politics, by the way, is a whole other confusing scenario, but with them, the biggest challenge is that they don't have a two-party system like we do. They have many, many, many parties. There's like 36 parties, and so you have to form a coalition, and it means you're appeasing these people and you're appeasing these people and trying to get leadership together, and it doesn't really work. Not that having a two-party system works very well either, but it's confusing. Yeah. Oh, yes, for sure. Yeah. Right. Right. Absolutely. And so it's always very funny for when you see, Christians who are so supportive of Israel, because for those of us who understand that, we're like, the only reason you're supporting Israel is because you're waiting for the Messiah to come back. It's not because you like us, so it's a little bit disconcerting, but it's still, yeah, absolutely, that he was, yeah. 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 Yeah, I mean, Birthright, so for those of you who don't know, Birthright is this program that when it originally started out, it was intended to be trips, and it was like matchmaking trips. They were really hoping to help young Jews find Jewish partners on these trips, and now it has really evolved over the years. They're not as explicit about trying to make love matches, because that's gross, right? Like, I can't believe that was their mission, but that was it. But they're trying to give young Jews a taste of what it's like in Israel by sending them on these free trips that are pretty A free trip to Israel is kind of awesome. But yes, but so the support of Israel in America was for a lot of different reasons. And it still remains an issue in Israel to this day, even though Bibi isn't in power anymore and Trump isn't in power anymore. There's still clearly the legacy of both of their leadership is felt very strongly in Israel. All right, any other questions, either about the Yoms or about Israel, anything like that? All right, so my last thing that I will just say is that we are planning an Israel trip for adults in December. So if you're interested, let me know. It is an adult-only trip, not in the risque sort of way, but just it's very... Wouldn't that be a funny trip? But just it's very different to travel with children than it is with adults. So if you're interested in that, let me know. But I would just say that all of these experiences in learning about Israel, it's best experience when you're there on your own. Every time I've been there in my life, it feels like both a homecoming and returning to a place that I've never seen before. Every time it's different. Israel is growing very, very quickly. In fact, this is probably a whole other class, but it's growing so rapidly and it's so expensive to be there now that many Israelis are finding it sort of hard to even know how to live there anymore, even in places like Sfat, which is really like, I love it, but it's not a nice place to live. And it is so expensive now. God, I forget the number that they told us, but something like if you want to live in Svat, it is the average cost of living is something like 500 times what most people make in their salaries. Like it is impossible to live there, and I can't even give you a comparison of what it's like to live in Svat. It's like, it's not East St. Louis, but it's not necessarily like the place that you want to hang out. Like, and even there, you can't afford it, so don't even worry about it. But so Israel is also, they have a whole other economic battle on their hands again that has nothing to do with race or religion or anything like that. So. All right, thank you everyone for coming. Our next one is going to be about Shavuot. That is going to be entirely virtual, in part because, and thank you guys for being here, thank you for watching from home, but it is super hard to do this both in person and virtually. So our next one is just going to be virtual, and then, God willing, we are going to be getting to a place where most people will feel comfortable just being back in person for the most part. But I'll see you next time. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I did have a really small
Tell me.
about one of them's really random.
Okay.
I don't know why it came to mind,
Tell me.
but every time I'm here, I notice it. Pretty much this entire room is based around the Star of David.
Correct.
Because I noticed it like in all of those and all of this around here, and the roof's all based on it. And it's every time I come here, I notice all the little stuff. Was it meant to be that way?
It was actually. So when this building was designed, so if you think
The old roof was
right,
crazy.
exactly. So this is a false. There's more behind this.
Yeah.
And this is a false stage too. Oh yeah. Oh, we're just talking about the architecture. So yeah. So the whole ceiling is designed like the Star of David, and what Michael was just saying is the roof. Dan was just saying is that the roof on the outside used to look like the tents of Jacob, and it was pointed, which was really cool.
Yeah.
But clearly, no one thought about what happens when it rains, and so like from the day it was built, there were huge problems with water. So when I started here, one of the things we did was raise money, and we basically built a cap over the roof, which is not nearly as attractive, but it used to be that we would be sitting here and it would fully rain on people's heads. Like,
Frank Lloyd Wright used to say, "I don't design buildings to be used; I design them to be seen."
Exactly.
That's
So
what it
that was the same with you.
Also, you had mentioned Elie Wiesel.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the same author of the book Night?
It is. Yes. So Elie Wiesel, so it's really interesting. So one of the other things, again, Dara Horn talks about this. She's so cool. But talks about the idea that even if you look at the books that have been written about the Holocaust, Night became sort of the way that people in high school read about the Shoah, which is great. It's a beautiful book. but what we read was not his original work.
Yeah.
His original work, super depressing, right? Night is so depressing, but there's a little bit of hope in it.
Yeah.
And it's the same thing with something like Anne Frank, right? Like Anne Frank, we love that book. Why? Because she says in it, you know, she still has hope. Right? But it was written obviously before she was deported. You know, right? Like what would have happened, you know, if she had written a book after she was deported? And so we have things like this, like Elie Wiesel, who was, you know, remarkable, but is still, we are reading his sort of cleaned up versions because the other stuff is too exciting.
Yeah. And lastly, and we may have learned about it before in Sunday school, I don't remember, but I know you mentioned the second visit of the Messiah. Yeah. Was there anything that like actually implied that he would visit again, or is it just something about hope?
So that's only in Christian tradition. So part of why Jews don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah was because we don't believe that there would be a second coming. We believe that once the Messiah comes, like, it's gonna be awesome, right? And so the second coming is something that Christianity basically invented. Just to say that Judaism didn't invent too, right? Like we all invented our own things, but the second coming is only within the Christian tradition.
Gotcha. So
when people ask, well, why don't you believe in Jesus? We always say, well, the Jewish teaching says that the Messiah will not die.
Yeah.
So.
All right. The very idea of a Messiah couldn't be to Judaism at all.
So there's when you're talking about the Holocaust Museum in D.C., right after it opened, I was at a doctor's office and I'm reading the National Geographic, which, you know, crazy, it was once printed. And it was this guy had gone through the whole thing, you know, great detail, incredible museum, you know, my person didn't make it, all that sort of stuff. And he said, I left thinking, thankfully we've got this, so this will never happen again. And he gets in a cab and it's a Rwandan driver who has just immigrated and he's the only one left from his family. Wow. It was just that like powerful moment of, I just went through all of this and we still haven't learned a thing from it. So. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so challenging for us to know how to have those discussions and to say, like, obviously, like, we should be learning about Rwanda. Like, I don't know if kids today learn about Rwanda, right? But like,
no.
How old are you that you say
not.
that? Like,
they don't learn about Rwanda. There's genocide going on right now, you know, and we don't. When you say that there's something that, as a Jew, I feel very strongly, you have to be saying it again. You actually have to mean it, and what it means to mean it.
And I think some of it is then the way we tell these stories. So I remember when I was in confirmation class here, my rabbi at the time, it was right when Schindler's List came out. You ever had to see Schindler's List? I don't have too much sense anymore. So it was a very, very powerful movie that Steven Spielberg made about the Shoah. And my rabbi was so pissed. Wow, this is like amazing that Steven Spielberg is making a movie. And he was like, Steven Spielberg could have made any movie in the world and everyone would have gone to see it because he's Steven Spielberg. He chose to make it about a hero of the Holocaust. And in the same non-Jewish hero. And so like in the same way that we read Elie Wiesel and we read Anne Frank, it's like he made a very palatable movie about the Holocaust that is about heroes. Yeah. And really what we should be looking at is those stories that are so upsetting that you can't walk away from them. So yeah. But otherwise people aren't reading. All right, you guys are awesome.
Thank you.
Sure.